It gives me great pleasure to welcome Wen-Chen Ouyang, Professor of Arabic and Comparative Literature at SOAS, the University of London, and Matthew Reynolds, Professor of English and Comparative Criticism at Oxford University, to today's session titled Translation, Literature, and Precarity. This session will be structured around two parts. First, a conversation with our guests, Wen-Chen and Matthew, on the questions of the role, or the roles, in fact, of a translation in forming bridges and connecting cultures in periods of precarity and uncertainty, including the spaces that literary translation open in response to displacement. And the second and final part, hopefully we'll have time to do so, is in fact to showcase a couple of pieces or fragments produced in Badawi camp in North Lebanon as part of our writing workshops, which span Jarash, Zarqa, and Zarqa in Jordan, and the Hamra neighborhood, Badawi camp, and Jabal al-Badawi in Lebanon. I will start, in fact, it's a conversation, so, and this question is, of course, to Wen-Chen and Matthew. What can we, in fact, say about the role of a translation in forming bridges and connecting cultures when so many people have been forcibly displaced? Do you think that a translation, both as a notion and a practice, can become an act of solidarity and a mutual recognition between, let us say, citizens and refugees and other refugees, one imagination and another? If so, in what ways? And so these are the questions that are going to be taken in turn and will be. You've got yours.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think, Yousef, thank you for inviting me, and it's really nice to be here. I've worked with you before, and I've also worked with Matthew before, so we're kind of friends and three musketeers today. And sort of like before we came here, Yousef had already assigned our roles and determined that sort of like the sequence will appear. So you'll see that we'll alternate. So thank you for being here. I have to say that in trepidation, I'm actually pretty much in awe of what you do, right? For I am a literature person. I look at literature and I keep thinking that, well, I want to do something, but I never managed to get out of the closet. But I want to sort of like start with something that will get me to what I think of translation as two things. And I'm going to start with my life in Libya and then meander my way into literature and translation. And I want to sort of like highlight literature first and then translation of literature. So I grew up in Libya under the rule of Muammar Gaddafi. When I was going to university, the two things I want to talk about as foreigners, right? I, as a Taiwanese, right, at the time, a citizen of Republic of China, right? And by 1973, we no longer existed as Republic of China because People's of Republic of China was recognized at the UN. But nevertheless, right, in Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, we went through a series of upheavals, including revolutions and cultural revolution and so on and so forth. But as a foreigner from Taiwan, we were protected in a cocoon of our foreignness. As long as you abide by the Libyan laws, you are fine, right? Even though under the circumstances with all the political turmoil going on in Libya, we knew we were ready, we had to be ready to leave any minute. So our suitcases were always packed, right? And we were just expecting that order, you have to leave today, because we watched people, one drove after another, being kicked out of Libya. And sort of like two things happening in my life at the time. I went to Libyan schools, and my friends were Libyans. And all the time, especially when I was going to university, friends started disappearing. Right? We heard about this. Friends started, especially classmates, boy classmates. Right? And in 1981, during the October War, right, all my Palestinian friends at the university were packed into a plane and sent off to quote-unquote Palestine to fight for Palestine, for their cause. And what I want to be able to say is, even though that was part of my experience in Libya, the sort of the kind of experience my friends had, or emotions they felt, right, when family members disappeared, or they themselves were disappeared, was an abstract thing, right? You knew about it, but I did not know how to respond to it in a much more concrete way. I just knew that my friends were gone, some of them were killed, and some of them never came back, and I didn't know what sort of like happened to them. And this brings me to literature. I think literature is translation itself, right? What literature does is it translates that abstract experience for me through language into an experience that I can understand, I can feel, and I can live, and I can sympathize, right? And I can share, right? And I want to sort of like start with a reading from Mahmoud Darwish. Do we know who Mahmoud Darwish is? Yes, of course. And I sort of like, I want to bring it home, right? In a sense, because I'm a coffee addict, right? And if you're a coffee addict and you don't get coffee, how do you feel, right? And this is from his, you have, okay.
Yes,
from, sorry, it's okay. We're equal in this. So this is, and the sort of, this is from his Memory for Forgetfulness, which is, even though it's written in prose-like language, but it is really a long poem, and it is a one-day diary of Beirut when Beirut was under Israeli bombing. So he doesn't sleep, he sleeps for 3 hours, and he gets up and he says, right, I want the aroma of coffee. I want nothing more than the aroma of coffee, and I want nothing more from the passing days than the aroma of coffee. The aroma of coffee, so I can hold myself together, stand on my feet, and be transformed from something that crawls into a human being. The aroma of coffee, so I can stand my share of this dawn up on its feet, so that we can go together, this day and I, down into the street in search of another place. So it goes on, right? But this paragraph is very key for me, right? And be transformed from something that crawls into a human being, right? And I think that's what literature is all about, is about how to be human being, and also about the kind of ethics that I heard discussed earlier today, right? So this is, literature translates Mahmoud Darwish's experience into something that I can understand, I can feel as my experience. And that brings us to the question of translating the Arabic text into English, and I think it performs that role as well, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, performs that role, and I'm going to sort of like hand over to Matthew to speak more about translation.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I think I'd missed the bit where Wen-Chen said that this conversation had been carefully programmed in advance. I think I probably missed that bit, but I do have some things to say. The thing I want to say in response to what the material that Wen-Chen's just shared with us is a kind of problem that I think there is, or a difficulty there is sometimes with the word translation and the baggage it can bring with it. So you can use translation rather in the way Wen-Chen was doing, and in a fluid way as a term for pointing to the sharing of experiences and meanings through language difference and across cultures. But often, though, when the word translation is used, it brings with it an idea of discipline. If you look at it brings with it the idea of there being such a thing as meaning, which you can extract from a language. It brings with it the idea of there being two separate languages that can be lined up and equivalence can be established between them. If you look, so I'm a literary person too, and I work mainly with European languages. If you look at the history of the development of ideas of translation in Europe, going back to the early modern period, it's completely coexistent and arm in arm with the development of the idea of there being separate standardized national languages, and the idea of the nation state as being a kind of monolingual culture that can be, there's a language called English that can be lined up with a language called French, and equivalence can be established between bits of writing in those languages. And the whole apparatus of grammar books, bilingual dictionaries, etc., goes together with that idea. And this then continues into colonial translation practices. So the idea there is that's operative here is that the sort of way I want to sum this up is that the word translation can create and establish language difference in order then to cross it. And so what I'm really interested in, I'm worried about, is the relationship between this disciplinary idea of translation, which in some contexts is completely, well, in some contexts is in many ways necessary. So, for instance, in our context here, I'm speaking standard English. We're using, I imagine most of us have been using quite a regulated kind of language, an academic kind of language. And because it's regulated in that way, it makes it, I hope, easier for the people who are translating us to translate, because they're translating it into another regulated kind of language. And there are other contexts, perhaps legal contexts or access to services, etc., where this kind of translation operating in a regulated way in order to achieve something that can be called communication, where that, that matters and is important. On the other hand, there's a tension between that idea of translation and this sort of quotation there is up here on the screen, and the kind of work Yousef has been doing, and indeed the kind of writing that literary writing is, which is to say that language does lots of things other than communicate meaning, when language is being used in more varied and human ways, in non-standardized ways, in particular local situations, in families, in varied speech situations, then you need a different way of thinking about translation. You need instead to think of translation as a matter of moving through language variety rather than establishing equivalence between separate languages, rather than the idea of it taking meaning out of a language and putting it into another standardized language. You need instead to think of it in terms of creating language material, as it were, together, a kind of sharing of meaning making through language. So this way of thinking about what it is to be in language, which is to say being in a continuum of language variation in which everyone is using language differently, there are dialects, there are many ways of speaking, etc. This non-standardized continuum of language variety, which is really what it is to inhabit language in a daily way. I think we need to see the difference between that and the sort of particular regime or technology that translation can become in more disciplined and standardized context.
Thank you very much. Please, Wen-Chen.
Okay, just, I like translation, and it's always good to have conversations about translation, but I'm an instinctual translator. I translate sometimes, but very instinctually. But for me, translation is about process, right? And for me, it is about encounter, right? When you're translating, it's about encounter between two languages, two texts, two literatures, and two cultures. There's no, and since, and I'm not emphasizing the difference in all these, right, in order to say that we cannot bridge the differences. Rather, I like to say that translation is the process through which we can bridge the differences, right? Not by gaining full understanding, but getting close to what the difference is. I think that's what I want to say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I would like, in fact, to return to Matthew's invocation of the regulated versus the unregulated way of translating things, and this, of course, question is for both of you. But how do we ensure that what we call the origin or the original language or the first language is being rendered non-hierarchically, especially when these, let's say, writings are produced and written by people who would like, in fact, the specifics of the daily to feature prominently? How would you, Matthew, perhaps...
I think it's. I think the really crucial thing there is to junk the idea of there being such a thing as a language that's separate from another language. Now, I mean, of course, you know, we need this idea. We need to, you know, you need to learn a language, but then beyond that, you get to the locality and the particularity of the instance of language rather than instance of a language that you're faced with. So I think as soon as, you know, if I'm saying, well, what I'm figuring as a standard English speaker who knows the correct use of this separate language called Standard English, it's really hard for that. That's an authoritarian position to take. But if I say I'm with the text that's in a different language, using language differently from me, I'm with the person whose language is different from mine. There's my particular language, there's my particular, by which I mean not my particular, you know, standard English, but the particular ways I have of using the language material that's available to me. And there are the particular other ways of using language that there are in the text or in the voice of the other person with whom I'm communicating, and then you find a way of sharing that. You find a way of, I think, and again, I think it's really important to sort of junk the idea of being able to say exactly the same, junk the idea of equivalence, junk the idea of, you know, lining things up in parallel, and instead the image you have in your mind is of finding different routes through things that can be shared in this language material, however different the grammars and vocabularies that are in play are. There's always shared language material that can be found in terms of rhythm, in terms of tones of voice, in terms of perhaps of language history, of shared aspects in the development of what have become separate languages, etc., that can be traced through. So for me, the key thing there is to firstly think of language as a continuum that is being reached through, rather than there being separate languages that are being bridged. And then secondly, to be really attentive to the particularity of the language instance that there is here. Things like tone of voice and handwriting, and particular idiom and particular dialectal variations, etc., etc. Oh, sorry.
Okay. How do I follow up on that?
Wen-Chen, I would like you, in fact, to tell us more about the term encounter in the context of a translation, because you've spoken about encounters, not just between languages but also across spaces.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sort of like, I want to come to this question by picking up from Matthew and relating it to my own work about multilingualism, and sort of like, and fundamentally what I think is that each language, how we the language as we understand it, I would conceptualize it as sovereign and bordered, right? I think that doesn't exist, right? I don't think so. I think each language itself is multilingual in two ways, right? And if we take Arabic as an example, right, before the 19th century, right, it had Turkish, Persian, right, Latin, right, Aramaic, and all these other languages. And these languages throughout centuries have become part and parcel of the fabric of the Arabic language. But in the 19th century, right, there was a shift from this kind of multilingualism to another kind of multilingualism. And Arabic, right, in addition to this old layer of multilingualism, was what had incorporated English, French, Italian, Spanish, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, Arabic language is really a multilingual language in which a lot of other languages have already come into it and used it as a site of a kind of encounter, right? It could be linguistic, it could be literary, and it could be cultural, right? And if you follow some of the terms in Arabic, the Arabic we use today, right, you'll see these conceptual categories, right, or ideas, right, or even ideologies that are grammaticalized, transformed into standard sounding Arabic. But if you just dig deep, right, it came from elsewhere and became integrated into Arabic thinking, Arabic thought, Arabic literary language, Arabic literary style through this kind of encounter that you can see within language itself. So that's number one. The other kind of multilingualism I'm thinking of is exactly what Matthew was describing in detail, in that language is not just word, right, but it is also sound. And you need the sound, right? If you read Arabic, right, the rhythm, the pace, right? Right? That's very, very sort of like the rhythm and the pace is very clear. Whereas you read, this is a more softer kind of Fatima mahlan ba'da hada tadalluli wa in kunti qad azma'ti sarmi fajmali. Right? So the two, right, words, sound, and the other one is visualization, right? And everything, language, visualizes, right? Comes with pictures, right? Image, right? And these are all part of language. And as we learners, we use language, right? We embody that language, right? So that's part of us. So, and these multilingualism, when you think about multilingualism, it's very messy, right? No grammar can encapsulate multilingualism. So when you're translating from something like modern Arabic poetry that is already multilingual into English, which I think is also multilingual, you have to junk the disciplinary idea. There's that authentic, sovereign, sort of original text that you can transform into that, English, sort of beautifully English text or something like this, or even that you can, through English, completely capture, right, the original text. There's no such thing because English has its own life, right? But I think sort of like in this kind of, for me, as in translation process, is this kind of encounter between, for me, would be two experiences, right? Or one experience expressed in a very in a language that's already complex, right? So and with another language that it has its own complex history and complex ways of expression. And what I would, for me, what I would like to be able to do is really make sure is the affect, right? The thought, right, can be conveyed rather than the sort of like the everything in the text. Does that make sense? Sorry, I go for the big things, not through the small things.
Matthew, I in fact, something that when Wen-Chen this is, I honestly, we have to sort of have this Homi Baba treatment just to make So Wen-Chen, in fact, did touch on the question of multilingualism. What's quite, I would say, pertinent in the Arabic language is, in fact, the term itself, lugha, language. And something that I came across, I think I did mention this to Wen-Chen at an event at SOAS, that Al-Azhari in his 9th, 10th century book, in fact, returned the term to its origin, which is laghwa, i.e. deficiency. So he wanted, in fact, to say something that was then appropriated by Ibn Manzur in the 13th century. He wanted to say that to begin with language, you have to begin with nothing, or in fact the multiple. So you cannot begin with singularity. This is something that occurs a lot in dialects in Arabic. For instance, at the writing workshops, Jordan, Lebanon, in the camps, in cities, in gatherings, when people, and we're talking about different levels of engagement with the language, with what's considered sound, what's considered perhaps grammatically sane, and what's considered dialectal, how people responded to writing, how people, and this is something that made us feel, in fact, I have to say that I struggled a lot with certain things that I was tempted to correct. Maybe not correct, alter, because I felt that as I was transcribing these written pieces, that maybe it was my job to correct or change. But then perhaps I must have done it a couple of times, and then I had to revisit the original or what was stated initially. And I felt that as though we're coming to writing as ruins, and then we're tampering with these ruins and creating something that is perhaps that appeals to us, but it doesn't appeal to the writing itself, as the person himself, herself, envisaged writing. And this takes us, in fact, Matthew, to the question of the guest-host, perhaps, dichotomy in writing and the translation. Who is the translator then when this text is being shared, in fact? So who has this role as the translator?
Oh, I think it has to be a shared role, really. I think translate. I mean, I think you bring language to the encounter with the text you're meeting or the person that you're meeting, and there's one in which, I mean, quite a lot of there's in the discipline called translation studies. There's a lot of attention to the individual doing the translating, which is important. The role of the translator as an individual, which is important. But on the other hand, there's also a way in which translation isn't really a matter of choice. It's sort of the words appear in the encounter between the language that you are bringing and the language that you're encountering. You can't really, I mean, okay, there is. It does happen. I mean, you do more real translation than I do, Yousef, but you're conscious. Yeah. But I mean, there's a way in which, okay, it is under the control of something that could be called choice, but it's more complicated than that because it sort of happens in the encounter of languages as well. I think when it comes to going back to the sort of framework I laid out at the beginning. When you've got that classic and disciplined idea of translation, in which translation is happening into something that's regulated and has an identity as a language, then that's not really that's not hosting in the sense that has been explored and is at the heart of this project, it seems to me. There's a lot of erasure and a lot of violence that is done in that sort of taking of an existence and putting it into a language. And so when you think, well, what would a translation practice that was more alert to the work of hosting, what would that be like? Well, it has to be shared. It has to allow the language that's emerging from the translation to change and be particular and be different from the standard. I really like translations. I really like multiple translations. So I like it comes out one way and then it comes out another way and then it comes out in another way. And what that gets away from is this sort of implicitly disciplinary idea that this is the version or this is what it means. If what's happening is a kind of opening up of meaning through different texts, I think that's a practice that's in line with ideas of hosting.
Would you like to perhaps comment to that?
Matthew didn't talk about it today, but I actually like his idea of translation as creative, right? So I think translation is creative. If you translate, and I think Yousef does, and sometimes I do a dabble. I do it for friends when friends say do this, and I say yes, I'll do it, right? It has something to do with that particular moment in your life, and I sort of call it material conditions of living, right? When you're reading a text, you're responding to it, right? You're not just responding to that text, you're responding to your own life, your own material condition of living. And it's not your whole life, is that parcel of geography and temporality, right? That particular moment, how you're responding to it. In a sense, if you ask me to translate a text, right, and then go back and retranslate it 10 years from now, I think I would translate it in a completely different way, right? So in a sense, a translator is really a reader, but also someone who internalizes that experience of reading as his, takes possession of that as his or her own, which I think makes it very problematic. Am I thinking? Sorry, I'm still jet lagged. Thinking of translation as, for me personally, as host or guest. But I think there's a point in that, right, which exists. Sorry, I think this is what I'm thinking. Outside of translation, the act of translation or the process of translation itself, which is the market. Why do we translate this text? Why do we translate Mahmoud Darwish? Who do we want to read Mahmoud Darwish, and who will make sure that Mahmoud Darwish is read, right? And there, I think you begin to get a sense of, right, guest and host, right? The guest and host, and the idea that there's a hierarchy, right? If you get translated into English, is, I don't know, I'm just saying it for the heck of it. English, then it's best, right? If it gets translated into French, second, maybe French first, right? German. If it gets translated in Chinese, we'll think about it, right? Something like this. So I think that's where you have that notion. So I think I should stop.
Thank you very much. On this question, in fact, of plurality in translation, just before maybe we project a couple of samples, I would like to tell you a bit more about the writing workshops and why, for instance, we, in fact, Elena, Alastair, Lyndsey, and Anna insisted on having what they call the literary component to the social science one. But in fact, it has never been seen as a supplement or as an extra. It has always worked I would say, hand in hand with the social science bit. And perhaps as somebody who's been involved in these things, running and co-running these things, I felt it's about not offering people space and not offering them voice. They have their own voices and they do not need really our sympathy. It's about simply saying, can we write about what we think is no longer part of our lives? Or what, for example, is hospitality for us after all? What does it mean to become perhaps a displaced person, is a refugee? But also is to say to yourself, you know what? I can write without thinking too much of maybe the humanitarian aspect of what this writing is going to engender and produce, is to write for the sake of writing, and to write and to say that this is my product and I've written something and it belongs to me. And so we're not talking about here a different, or what Elena calls the multi-scalar sort of maybe way of reading these writings. And I think that these writings are valuable on their own right. They belong to themselves. They resemble the situation, the individual, the community. But also they convey the specifics and the differences that these people try to maybe write about, even in the language, and how different levels of knowledge, as in the script and the grammar, and also the way you structure ideas and write for an audience or for yourself. So, and these, please, are not representative of what we've got. These are done for the sake of this informal conversation, and these are produced in Badawi camp. It's a camp in North Lebanon. And Elena, could you please just I think that yes. Yeah, but let's comment. Matthew, I've changed one thing without consulting you, so please forgive me. I'm not going to tell you about it.
Okay. Surprise us.
Yes. So we'll begin with this. Is it clear? So who would like, in fact, to read it in Arabic? We have several, I believe, Arabic-speaking people. Reem, please, putting you on the spot here. Just to...
If I misspell a word?
What's that?
If I misspell a word, I'm sorry. وروحه تصعد إلى بارئها صدمتها طائرة MIG ميك كانت جثته المطحونة تحت جنزير الدبابة تهمس بصمت اتركوا لنا منفذا آمنا إلى السماء. الطفل الذي نجا من الغارة لم ينجو من آثارها. كان ينتظر جولة أخرى من القصف تعيده إلى كنف العائلة.
Could we please have, no, not because Reem hasn't done well, but could we please have another reader of the Arabic? Just to see how even enunciations of it, just...
وروحه تصعد إلى بارئها صدمتها طائرة ميك كانت جثته المطحونة تحت جنزير الدبابة تهمس بصمت اتركوا لنا منفذا آمنا إلى السماء. الطفل الذي نجا من الغارة لم ينجو من آثارها. كان ينتظر جولة أخرى من القصف تعيده إلى كنف العائلة.
Thank you very much. I am sure that you can see the projected English here, and this is just a rough translation, in fact. I must admit here that I must have added maybe a couple of commas. So I transcribed these as they were. I added a couple of commas maybe, or a full stop. And even punctuation marks, in fact, matter. Even, not because those involved in these writing workshops didn't pay attention, but perhaps what we call ellipses, what we call maybe punctuation marks, benignly were left or ignored, overlooked on purpose. But in fact, we didn't have time to ask the participants about their choices in these texts. So we collected them and then we ran away. That was it. And this is really important for us to see how, in order, especially in research, you have a limited time, you have a week or so to compile certain things, and then, of course, we have to think about the individual behind these texts, and how Patricia was talking about exiting and to have the right to exit. And this is really painful when you work with people. I arrived in this country as an asylum seeker. And I became a refugee. So this evolution then, of course, ended up with this citizen label. And I wanted to go to see my sister in another camp, in Nahri Barid camp, in Lebanon, in North Lebanon, my eldest sister, who hasn't been well. And I, of course, because I've been here for 12 plus years, I haven't renewed what they call the Palestinian identity for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And because Nahri Barid was destroyed in 2007, it's still considered a war zone. So I was admitted on the condition that I submitted the British passport, the only thing that I had, to this person at the checkpoint, the soldier. So they kept the passport for 40 minutes, for an hour. My older brother refused to leave the passport. He's a Palestinian from the Badawi camp, where I was born. He wanted to protect the passport in my absence. So I went to see my sister, and he was there guarding the passport, simply because he was scared that this piece of documentation might disappear. So the question of exiting, how you enter a space, you work with people, and then you disappear. Now I have the right, maybe, or the privilege to do so because I hold a British passport. But what about those who produce, remember, write, and then they are simply left behind, and they act as, at times, numbers when it comes to surveys and the statistics? What about the human value in writing? And this is something that maybe we've been trying to not necessarily capture, but maybe to touch on. I don't think that, I would say maybe it's impossible to grasp this entirely in writing, but at least to say that this is a gift, and this is something that maybe that goes beyond the social science, that goes beyond the survey, something that maybe is written with the intention of writing, not anymore. So we'll start maybe with Matthew. Matthew, just your maybe take or your reflections on the English in front of you, and
well, I guess what I suppose the thing I want to say is that the kind of translation that then gives you a printed text, I think it's really important just to see that that's just part of the human processes of interaction and understanding it, sort of that Wen-Chen was talking about right at the beginning, actually, which is to say that people sometimes look at the printed text as though that's the end point, but actually that's just something that is then going to be read as we heard the first text being read out. It's going to be read by read out in voices, but also go into different people's imaginations in different ways. And so, I mean, I can. I don't know. I can't read the Arabic at all. So it was. I was very interested to hear it being read out. And I can get something from the English. But my feeling about the English in relation to the Arabic text that I don't know, and what Yousef has explained about the context, is of a sort of thwartedness or kind of I don't know, small. I don't like to use the word inadequacy, but sort of smallness or something. And I kind of want more, so that I feel that I would like it, and also a standardness, so that it's as though it's not in anybody's language. It's just in the language of the dictionary almost. And then what I'd like is that it to be in somebody's language and somebody else's language. So more particular kinds of English. I'd like to sort of say, well, what would an ideal translation process for this Arabic text be like? To me, it would be a sort of a plural thing that included readings, that included different versions, that sort of enabled me to participate imaginatively in what was being written more, I suppose. So to me, the English text here is the kind of beginning of a translation practice, is what I feel, I suppose.
I know exactly what he's asking me to do. So I'm going to have to sort of like translate the Arabic into the sound and the visual and the process, right? The plurality of reading. So for me, writing, right, especially in the Palestinian and refugee context, right, is flesh and blood, right? And language, embodied language, is flesh and blood, right? And you feel it viscerally when you read Arabic, right? So here you have that, right? وَرُوحُهُ تَصْعَدُ إِلَى بَارِئِهَا صَدَمَتْهَا طَائِرَةٌ مَيْغ, right? In a sense, if you think about sort of the Arabic, right, syntax, right, it's not as clearly threaded as English you have, right? So روحه وروحه تصعد. Ruh is spirit, is the soul. It could be any of these.
And the feminine.
Yeah. تصعد إلى بارئها, to its creator, right? صدمتها طائرة ميغ. And here the sort of like the ambiguity, right? In Arabic, when you have pronominal suffix, it's ambiguous. It refers to what? It could refer to anything that came before. Ta'irat mig, right? So this is one thing, right? So we have a spirit, a soul that's ascending, but this, what did the plane hit? The soul or the body? The soul, right? And if I go into my Chinese sort of thinking, but spirit is shaffaf, transparent, right? It cannot be hit. It's not a body, it's not corporeal, how can it be hit? Right? So there's one. And then there are two things, right, going on at the same time. Why is the ruh tas'ad is going up, right? Going up, right? It's upward. Why is it not going right or left or whichever direction? And then you have ta'ira, right? Plane. But tara in Arabic is to fly. Right? So there are lots of associations going on here. I mean, are we, right? And are we imagining that this is bombing that's happening, right? In a sense, it's chaotic. Up there, everything is flying around, right? And you're not feeling solid, yeah? Okay, you're not grounded, right? And then we come to, and then there's no punctuation, right, in Arabic. And in Arabic, because that's for me, right? That's the pace and rhythm, the tune of your feelings that came through language as you write or as the language progresses, right? كانت جثته, and jutha, right? Jutha in Arabic is very clear. It's a corpse, right? That person's body, right? Al-mathuna. Now this one is brilliant, right? It's not crushed per se. It's from tahuna. Tahana is to grind it into powder, right? And you can, if you've read enough Arabic, you can see this rahi going on. Something is grinding it non-stop, right? So Are we talking about this bombing that's become this tahuna that grinds our bodies into powder, right? So that we no longer exist, we're just powder. تحت جنزير الدبابة. And this is, again, right, down to earth, right? The whatever, جنزير, I don't know how. Yeah, the chain of the tank. And then تحمس بالصمت, right? There is a paradox here. Samt, silence, no sound. تحمس, whispers. What's going on here? اتركوا لنا منفذا آمنا إلى السماء, right? Now, leave us. And then the shifts, the sort of like verb, right? اتركوا, the sort of address changes to you in the plural, masculine. Who are you? Leave us, right? منفذا آمنا إلى السماء. And you think spirit, you're not bound anyway, right? But manfad is not root as we think of it in English, but it's this gap, right? Interstices. Yeah, that like masra. It's just tiny gap that allows you in this blockade that allows you to slip through. Yeah. So in a sense, there's what you get, right? Is this sense of siege everywhere where you have nowhere to go, right? And even spirit has nowhere to go. Soul has nowhere to go. Soul itself is sort of corporeal that can be blocked, right? So that's what I get out of it.
Yeah.
Right?
In fact, Matthew, Wen-Chen did also talk about in fact gender here, and the feminine spirit, the feminine soul, and how can we, in fact, reconstitute at times certain gendered words in translation without maybe compromising their positionality in the text itself? How can we translate the gender of a word?
I think I just think you can allow. You can allow English to change, and you can use a gender. You can use her. She was hit by Mig, but also I just think, and this so this is where this kind of instance, I think, also is what's important about it is not only how we handle this kind of text in this kind of situation, but the sort of challenge it offers to our assumptions about language use in general and what writing should be like, etc. And so that I feel that the sort of the readers should be when and this goes back to this sort of disciplinary idea of translation and the overlap between translation as a practice of language learning in which you want to show you've got the words right and you know how to use them in line with kind of ideas of correctness, and the sort of the clash between that and literary or personal or individual or creative uses of language when it's all about doing different and non-standard things. So I think writers should feel the permission to do strange things with English, invent new words, kind of add bits of code, do things with marks and handwriting, etc. But this can be part of a process of sort of trying out different versions. So you can have a version that's in a kind of, standard English, and then you can have different versions that are trying out different things for readers to offer to readers to see if they're willing to sort of welcome them and enjoy them, if they're willing to enter into those practices in their turn. And so I think this kind of writing should open onto in a sort of loosening up or something, or an opening onto a sort of greater experimentality in the way that language can be used.
Thank you. I think, Elena, am I right? Able to spend maybe another 10 minutes? Yeah. Just, in fact, to comment on something that Wen-Chen did touch on, and the term janzir in Arabic. And am I right that it's translated as the chain, or the is it the right term? And I'm sure that you can't see it in the English. So all of a sudden, and this is my choice, perhaps it's an awful choice, to compromise the component parts of this machinery of death and to present it as a singular. And so instead of perhaps saying that the chain of what you call the genitive, here I've simply compromised and disrupted the word chain and got rid of it, and I kept tank. And this, in fact, simply would maybe take us to your choices as people who are looking at the text in front of you, and we would, in fact, love to hear from you. And could we maybe, who is going to hold? Am I right that we don't have this little thing that? Can you, Elena, manage this? Just.
I think we need Homi Baba to do it.
Absolutely. So Wen-Chen very wisely and very kindly said that we need Homi Baba
to do it for us. To do it for us.
So please, I think not if you have any questions, any queries, just to, in fact, to comment on the name. These texts are produced by Muhammad, who's in his early 30s, and because we should have consulted with him about projecting these things. That's why we have concealed, or we haven't shown the name. But just to maybe to let you know that, of course, the person exists, and the person is the writer.
Thank you. I have a bit of a technical question, specifically about the workshop. I'm assuming that you did the workshop with people who don't identify as writers, perhaps. So what, or maybe you do, I don't know, you should correct me if I'm wrong. Do they identify as writers themselves? And what was the process for you to come up with this? Was it several workshops? Did you just do one workshop? Did you have any prompts for thoughts? I would just like to know a bit more about what you did and how you did it.
Again, okay.
It's more of a comment, like for the usage of the word body instead of corpse, as you said. Like with body, when I think about it, I think of dimensions and entity rather than, like for corpse, it relates it back to a dead figure rather than a physical entity that has dimensions, and it could be referring to anything with dimensions rather than a corpse has I think a more influence on us as readers than body, just because of the whole idea, like imagery wise. When I think of corpse, I think of corpse, and as you said, a grinded corpse. So the horrific imagery here would create or elicit a bigger reaction from me than reading his crushed body. So that's the only thing.
And yes, please.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I was just, I think I want to comment on the Janzir al-Dababa. I think it's this contradiction between the Janzir, which is the chain, and the whispering sound of the dead person. This contradiction of al-Hadir, which is a very loud roar of the sound of the chain of the tank, and the very gentle sound of whispering, which is a very silent one, that should be highlighted, and I think Muhammad wanted to highlight that as well. And the second thing is a question to all of you. When you are a researcher and you're collecting stories, And these stories are entities in themselves. You are trying to take this experience, this harsh experience of refugees and migrants, and show it to others. How can you translate these stories from Arabic to English, for example, with retaining the meaning, the pain that is in the stories, without imposing your own translation and your own interpretation of these stories, in a sense? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I, in fact, will begin with Matthew with regards to. Wen-Chen, would you like to?
I mean, I don't know how to do it. Yeah. You don't. I can only explain, do things around it. You know, so I've done a lot of translation workshops and worked with. It's really not. I don't know how to do it. Confession.
Yeah, I mean, I think you. There is it can't be that, obviously it can't be the same, and so you think about the ways of, as Wen-Chen was saying, the ways of retelling and explaining, but I mainly work in academic literary context, and I think there is a particular thing about this kind of environment, this academic environment, and I think we should see, so that we should see the bringing of stories of anything into this context as a particular kind of translation, and certainly in the fields that I'm more usually in, I think not remotely enough attention is paid to that, which is to say that what we're doing in a room like this usually is behaving in particular ways, following in particularly regulated ways, and using language in particular ways, and I think I don't have an answer to it, but I think it does need to be perpetually thought about and worried at, really, the kind of translational remaking that happens to anything when it's brought into this space to be discussed, this sort of space.
Thank you, Matthew. Wen-Chen, would you like to add?
I mean, sort of I do a series of translation workshop with Marina Warner, and I think that's where what we do is we do the multiple translations that Matthew talks about within the group, and I think that's even though it's very limited, right? So we look at text, passages, and many people take part in translating it, and we sort of spell it out and so on and so forth. I think that's a good context, right? In a sense, what you look for is not the end product, right? There will be an end product that's hoped for, which is much more creative, right? Translated into something more visionary, more creative, more artistic. But the process itself, I think, is very sort of like useful. Right, and in one particular workshop, what the translator did was to, they were showing us the process of translation, and they decided to leave all the different versions, right? And the different versions actually give you a better sense of what you're translating than one version necessarily, And it's so, but to be honest, I don't think that's enough, right? That doesn't nearly. And it would never convey the kind of horror that in these two lines that I can only imagine, right? It can never do justice. It can never convey that experience, right? Muhammad's experience, for example. Yeah.
I just on the question of, in fact, what Jumana, am I right, highlighted, and. Rightly so, of course, and this is really a rough translation that was sort of completed, done very quickly for the sake of this discussion. It's not about offering or providing something that is considered, let's say, semi-complete, or that reads in conjunction with the Arabic. And I know, and of course, well, you've mentioned the Jinzir, you've mentioned, and this continuity, in fact, of the sound ha and ruh and mathoon, and then you have the jazir and then jutha. And these are things that have been compromised and I would say killed in this text. But perhaps this act of killing these particular sounds resonates with this overarching killing that is taking place in this, maybe, perhaps let's call it text 1 or translation 1, and eventually we'll have maybe translation number 15. With regards to the frequency, am I right that you asked about how, whether they consider themselves to be writers?
Yeah, the process of the
And I have to say that we've never asked this question, because who are we to ask a person whether you're a writer or you're not a writer? Because writing is not, in that sense, is not a profession that comes with certain structures, as it were. People can write, and also something else that I've been dealing with is somebody who can't write, can't read, wanted to take part in the writing workshops. And in fact, I did ask this individual to record his voice. And this is something what I've been transcribing. But it is really wonderful to see how writing itself, it transcends writing. So you end up dealing with people, because we cannot say that those who cannot read and write cannot be writers. In fact, they can. They can. And this takes us back to the question of who owns the story, and what, in fact, the word story means, and what these texts would eventually mean to a reader. Was there a third question, or just Reem, you did mention
It was just about that, but I also want to ask, because as a transcriber or translator in my research, I always found it difficult trying to portray, if I'm translating from Arabic to English, to portray the message. And when I included it into my research, you always feel a bit guilty because you don't know how to actually do it. Do you do it word by word, or do you try to reform it in a way that's actually understandable by the reader, but at the same time try to keep the pain that's in their voice, for example, or the pain in their story and the history in their story and background? So is there any advice on how to try and convey that message without, let's say, undermining their experience, or trying to, I don't know what to say, yeah, that's the question. Any advice on how to try to portray
Wen-Chen, would you like to?
I don't know how to do that.
I have to say that I do not know how to. Translation is about trespassing borders, is about crossing borders, is about also, as Matthew, of course, is rightly and theorized and written about, it's about also the notion of the prismatic, of the multiple that comes out of what is viewed as a singularity and as a singular. So these are the things that appeal to me as somebody who's reading something in front of him, because these are also, we have to remember, how can we capture the texture of the voice in the translation? How can we capture that particular human condition when this piece was maybe written or conceived of? These are incredibly complex things, but what we're trying to say is that, and this is something that we're going to offer to the people who are involved, the participants, the writers who are involved in these workshops, we are going to say, would you like to work with us on the translation? Would you like to go and translate it yourself? Because some of these people speak other languages. They don't just speak the Arabic language, they are really nuanced and articulate, and they can do things on their own. Whether they would like to keep their translations in addition to their texts, absolutely fine. This is something that we we're going to do.
Please join me in thanking the panel.